Welcome to Conversations with Shlomi.
Hi, I'm Shlomi, your host. I've discovered that vulnerable conversations lead to some of my richest insights and personal growth experiences. So join me as I sit down with guests who inspire me, and let's explore our ups, downs, and everything in between.
Enjoy listening.
Hi, today I get to speak with Devora Shabtai, the Director of Specialty Programming at Beachway Therapy Center in West Palm Beach, Florida. Her work focuses on clinical program design for addiction and trauma in rehabs, in the rehab setting. And I think the idea that our culture is a real big piece of the rehab experience is something that you focus on. So kosher recovery and Jewish identity in rehab is something we're definitely going to be talking about. You're a LCSW, PhD candidate, and I'm sure many, many more things that I'm missing. And I would like to invite you, if there's anything else that you feel like is missing in this introduction, please supplement it.
No, thank you. Yes, and thank you so much for having me on, to have a conversation that I know is very, very important for both of us and for the community at large.
Good. As I told you right before we started recording, like this is a conversation that's near and dear to me because I want to understand the rehab experience, how to make it the most successful, what to look out for. I as a clinician that sometimes has to refer people to rehab, I want to learn more. So maybe we can just really kind of jump right into it. Like, what is a rehab?
Absolutely. I think that's a question that has been very much a mystery to many people, especially to families who they're in a position where they have a loved one, they're being recommended for a higher level of care. It's a whole new world, and they don't know where to start. And as you and I spoke about, there are so many unfortunate stories of people who are so excited to finally get the help that they need, and they go into a program and they come out and nothing changes, or sometimes things get worse, and families have spent money and effort and hope. And I think it is something that I personally made into a mission to really try to help educate families and help connect them to the right care, because it is so confusing. So I think in a nutshell, if we want to really understand, what is this mysterious land called rehab, it's really typically the beginning of a longer process, where a person who has not been functioning, who has been struggling in various ways, whether it's addiction, mental health, um, all sorts of different labels we can stick on. So simply put, a person is not living with the degree of vitality of functioning that they can be. It's time to kind of make some type of real move, real change. Outpatient therapy might not be working, different interventions, the person is still stuck. And so what rehab typically provides is this place, this environment, this cocoon where a person can come away, from their day-to-day life and the environment that is not working for them, and come into an atmosphere that includes clinical work. But more than that, it's really a community where they're kind of now invited to be part of a new world where two things can kind of typically happen. Professionals can get a much deeper sense of what the struggle is, right? We kind of can have this wraparound panoramic view of a person that, simply put, we cannot have if they're living at home and we're seeing them in an office, inside of four walls once or twice a week, right? So we bring the person into this environment, and it becomes, so to speak, a laboratory where if we have the right eyes on them, we're really starting to understand what's going on. How are they functioning? How are they relating to people? What's going on with them in all sorts of different ways. But more than that, it's really the opportunity for a person to have a whole new lens, than they've been able to have before, because they're coming away from the triggers, they're coming away from the environment, and so they're having this internal opportunity, and the providers are having another opportunity. But it's not this magical. I always say it's not a car wash where you come in and we're expected, to have you leave and there's been major change. It's the beginning of a process. And so if done right, it kind of shifts the person's thinking, opens them up more. It shifts our understanding, the person's understanding, the family's understanding of the struggle. And then we can start the work in a whole different way afterwards. And so when we look at rehab, what we're really thinking about is the kind of the first step, the kind of the ripping off the Band-Aid so that we could have a new opportunity to work with a person on a more meaningful level. But it is in no way, shape, or form what many families think it is, which is where I think there's been a lot of misinformation and disappointment, that the whole transformative process happens, in those 30, 60, 90 days. That's simply put not what happens.
I really like this. Let me reflect this and then maybe dive a little deeper. On the one hand, for the clinician, we can actually observe a person in their natural setting, how they are conducting themselves, not just how they're presenting themselves for 1 hour, 2 hours, even 5 hours a week in a room, but in the clinician's room. But we see them in their full environment and get to experience them. And also for the client, being in this cocoon and setting where they get to be free of whatever the compulsive behavior slash substance, and they get to experience themselves also in a bit of a different setting and seeing, hey, wow, what is actually going on with me? And I think I love the analogy of the car wash. Like, I think that most people, it's not always only families. Like I said, I'm going to send my 17-year-old to rehab, and then they come out really clean and polished, and they're all good. um you hear celebrities talking about, okay, I really needed to go to rehab and then I'm going to be good. This idea that we go to rehab and we're fixed, you're dispelling that notion in no uncertain terms. Like, it's a beginning of the process. It just creates in some ways like a firm, beautiful way to potentially start a meaningful new beginning with better understanding for both clinicians and for the person themselves.
Absolutely.
But
And don't get me wrong, when it comes to rehab, it's just like anything else, right? The flavors and the colors and the sizes and the shapes are all different, right? The content of what happens in the rehab, what the groups look like, what the staff is trained in, superficially, just right, what the rehab looks like, what the experience is going to be, what the food is served, like all of those things are vastly different when it gets, from rehab to rehab. And I think a lot of people overly focus on some of those details and those micro components when they're looking for a program. But yes, conceptually put, the kind of the function, from my experience, of where we want to use the rehab episode of care is exactly that. It's saying we're gonna first and foremost, we're gonna take the person away from the substance, the behaviors, the unhealthy environment. We're gonna place them into kind of a very sterile, clean, monitored environment where we have them in kind of in a safe, secure wraparound environment. But there is now this additional piece I think many people lose sight of. It's that there's a lot of organic, natural, social situations that are happening, right? They're with peers and they're going to be triggered, and they're with staff, and so many of the struggles that they've been having on the outside, the patterns of behavior on the outside, those same things are going to come up, sometimes even more. Because if I am now with other people, and part of my struggle on the outside has been relating and connecting and being vulnerable and trusting, and now I'm with this group of people, and each one of them usually typically represents someone in their life, right? We always say, when they first get in, they're going to find their mother, their father, the Rebbe, the friend that abandoned them, the romantic relationship. Like, someone is going to look like every one of those people and trigger them in that way. But now they're in this therapeutic community environment where we could start to help push them and guide them and process them and process what's going on for them in a whole new way, in a much deeper way, because real things are happening, but at the same time, it is a simulation of an environment. And so that is a very unique thing to be able to introduce in a person's treatment. But again, the details are so much less important. If we can have them start off in that setting, and if they could leave with more clarity as to what is actually the nature of the struggle, right? Is this a biological, mental health, condition that has not been properly evaluated, assessed, and addressed? Is this something in the, more of a trauma related, attachment related issue? that we got to see, because for 30, 60 days they were living with us, and we got to see how they navigated social relationships. What were their defense mechanisms? What did they do in the face of discomfort? Were they isolating? Were they creating personas? Were they overbearing? What became their role? Right? We're in a rehab setting. We get to watch all of this 24/7. Right? From the moment they wake up, we get to see how are they functioning, how are they living, um, and it's all being part of an evaluation. And so I write Rehab will be using everything that happens, even their poolside conversations, their dinner table conversations. We're going to watch that, and we're going to put that into our conceptual understanding of what's been going on with them, alongside the typical psychiatric evaluation, the clinical work that they're doing. And we just get so much of a deeper understanding. But all that has to then be built into a treatment plan for aftercare. And I think if we look at rehab as a place to set up aftercare, that is typically where I see a lot of success. Yes, if we think it's going to be this quick, and I think that the celebrities, they made it into a fad because it checks off a box. If I'm addicted to something and I go into this program and I'm doing what I have to do, there's a lot of superficial, things that now I can say I've done, but it's really hard work, and it's just the beginning.
I see. So what does it look like in a good rehab? And we'll maybe talk a little bit the difference between, there are many places that can call themselves rehab. There are for-profit, not-for-profit, and we'll get a little bit into it. But a rehab that is serious, that is actually trying to set people up for success. A person comes in, what happens? Like, what's the process? What should they expect? What does it look like? What does day-to-day living there look like? Bring us in.
Absolutely. So I always, joke with families. The rehab is very much, we can look at it like a Shana Aleph, yeshiva experience, right? Where they are fully immersed in the process day in, day out. They're living on campus, with us 24/7. They wake up in the morning. They're expected to go to groups, which typically can, be from early in the morning, 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, to the afternoon, 3 p.m. Where they're in groups all day, every day. That becomes their full-time occupation, is really the being in therapy. And the groups can range from all sorts of topics to skills-based, to kind of deeper, identity, self-esteem, relationships, all sorts of different groups. Um, they're getting individual therapy. They're being met by a team for support. They're getting psychiatric, evaluation, and oftentimes there might be a medication management. So while the medication is, being tweaked, we get to watch, so we can kind of very easily tweak medication. They're doing their clinical work. And often, and this is where rehabs will change, there's different activities, and there's kind of different ancillary services that are happening in the evenings. Typically, there are 12-step program meetings that are happening, at night. Uh, but really, so much of the magic and the lasting change happens when a person starts to develop relationships with their peers, right? That community element of a rehab is so crucial. And it's been really meaningful for me, actually, more so than anything clinical, to watch a person who came in, a shell, scared, isolating, not feeling they could trust anyone in the world. And then week after week, as I walk through the campus and I see that same person starting to connect with others, and then a week later, I see that person laughing and smiling, and proactively going over to other people and you can sense the comfort when they're sitting in that group by the pool, and watching that, just the micro shifts and how the person is connecting to other people. To me, that tells me so much more about how they're doing than what's happening, in a group or in a one-on-one session. As you start to see them coming out of, the shell into themselves, being able to now feel safe connecting. And so much of a rehab really is learning to feel safe, us seeing and them seeing where they don't feel safe, um, and getting to really understand, is it because of do they not feel safe with the staff, right? Do they have issues with authority and not trusting systems and structures? Is it because when there's rules and they're told they can't have their phone and they start to feel like people are, controlling them? Is that where the safety starts to erode? Is it with their peers and feeling like they're being judged, and they can't fit in and nobody understands them, and they feel uncomfortable socially? Is that the trigger? So there's so many different potential triggers in the rehab setting. And that often also becomes, a big part of it. So simply put, there's a schedule, but really it's that they're now living with us and engaging with us 24/7. And that's the experience. They're not typically leaving the campus all that much. So really everything that happens is kind of in that one place. There's also family work, that's being done, as well, which is a huge piece of this. And a lot of what I end up, spending my time on is really inviting families to engage in the process as well. Um, and so we can kind of liken it to living in a dorm, in a school, where they're expected to do some hard work during this time.
Okay. So there's a lot of groups, um, skills groups like maybe DBT for the therapists listening, like learning how to adapt to life, but also a lot of processing groups where we learn what self-esteem is and watch the relationships between the members in the groups, learning to relate. And whatever happens in the process of the group, we get to observe and learn and grow from. And then there is a lot of wraparound services, like such as psych evaluations. There is individual clinical work with a therapist in a contained environment where we can learn and observe a lot. When I come in, someone comes into rehab, is the first thing that they get like a full evaluation? Is that like kind of like the entry point is that they get to be evaluated by psychiatrists, psychologists, biology. Um, what is that later on? Is that right in the beginning? Is that like a prerequisite to begin?
Yeah, typically that's in the beginning. They are kind of getting, we call it the intake process, right? So they are sitting with the different providers and being asked many, many, many questions, the first couple of days. And so that does involve, right, a lot of sharing their story, a lot of sharing their history, their treatment history, their medical history, their clinical history, their trauma history. So we're getting all of that information. And I will say, one of the differentiating factors I found in terms of the quality of a rehab is what are they doing with that information, right? Because obviously, for insurance purposes and all sorts of liability, we have to collect information and it kind of goes on our electric medical record system. But I find that really where this starts to come to life is, are we looking at the information we're gathering and putting that into a picture? Are we kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, this person is coming in with a story, and there have been certain things that have not been ever addressed and not been fully understood. So how are we going to take the information we're gathering and the information now we're getting in real time by watching them in this kind of, again, this laboratory, so to speak, and putting it together into a meaningful integrated picture where we can then say, okay, this is the therapy that they would benefit from. This is, the environment or the life structure. Maybe it is that they don't have meaning in their life, and that's kind of what we're seeing. And so we're going to recommend one thing. Maybe it's that they're not on the right medication, right? There's such a range of potential gaps in care. And I think that, back to what you said about the DBT and all of that, I always laugh, how much people look for specific modalities when they Google rehabs, right? I want a DBT rehab. I want an attachment-based trauma rehab. I want one that's going to offer EMDR. I want one that's going to offer equine therapy, right? We have as a group of people, especially parents, right? When we attach ourselves to a specific thing that I heard that's going to cure everyone, right? It's going to be the magic formula. Now I want the rehab to be all about that. And so kind of answering, both questions about what the groups contain, it's really about properly making what we say individualized work, which is this big cliche word everyone uses. It's really about having a lot of resources at our disposal, right? We want staff that's trained in all sorts of modalities, but then it's about throwing that out the window and saying, what does this person need? And how can I use my arsenal of different things I can offer in a rehab setting? How do I tailor, to this person? And I think that that's the difference. The more uniform, rehab is, where they specialize in one modality and that's going to be one size fits all, I would run the other way from those rehabs, right? There's no such thing. as a DBT program being, the solution for everyone. So that intake that they do is very important, and it's really something I think people need to use a lot more, finesse when understanding. I think a lot of it is in terms of the staging, and I want to just focus on this for a moment, right? The kind of like the timeline. So an intervention that might be a life-saving intervention for someone at a certain stage, if they're not yet ready for it, it's going to do absolutely nothing. And I think another feature to look for in a rehab is, do they have the ability to kind of have different phases? Where the beginning might be, typically it's a stabilization phase, right? When people call in and they're coming into rehab, it's because something acute often is happening, right? They are like, something changed. Either they are more dysregulated, there's more risk involved, the addiction has progressed, something is happening where now it's getting on the radar of the family or, the community, that they need help. So the beginning phase of rehab often is what we call a stabilization. We're making sure that the person has the skills to regulate if medication is needed. They're starting to kind of learn, build trust, kind of come back to their, adult self if they've been triggered and are now more in a more amygdala based fight or flight. So we're just giving them that platform to land. And so that's another thing where, if, even if a rehab is specializing in trauma work, it's not the time to introduce that work in the beginning. And so a rehab with a sophisticated staff will have stages where the beginning is going to be about the stabilization. But then if it stops there, right? If a person who does need to kind of go deeper and do that, that core work, that soul surgery kind of work, where we do need to reprocess traumatic experiences, and help equip them with more secure attachment capability. So if we just stabilize them and then we say, you're okay, just like a hospital might do, you're good to go, you're no longer suicidal, you're no longer manic, you're no longer, craving. If we don't then also introduce the deeper work when now they are receptive to it, that's also not going to yield long-term success. So it's really about getting to know the person and having a program that is designed for the natural organic phases, so that once they're stable, I can introduce deeper work. And also, I want to just take a moment to say another function of rehab that I didn't touch upon is, because it's this safe, contained environment, we often could do more riskier type of therapy than if we're outpatient. So if we know that a person has, a developmental trauma, but we have never really been able to do that deeper work without risking them, falling apart and getting triggered and having some kind of episode, because we need to keep them functional. So rehab provides that immersive experience where I could do the psychodrama, I could do the experiential trauma work, I could do all sorts of things, where now I know that when they leave the office, they're going to be watched. They're going to have a safe, supportive network the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the rest of the month. It allows for us to go a little bit deeper. So sometimes in rehab, we send someone in for acuity, but sometimes we send them in because they need more intensity than we've been able to do. And so that is another thing to kind of consider.
So you mentioned before, I really like this. I wrote down a couple of things that I want to um, uh, get back to. You mentioned earlier that you think family work is very important. Let's just talk practically. You are in Florida. Many people attending, maybe coming to rehab, are not living in Florida. What does family work look like? Is it on Zoom? Is it remote?
Yeah. Such an important question. So, simply put, I can tell you, how we operate it in our program is, we very much believe in the concept of parallel process, right? That we want families the whole time that their loved one is in our care to be, focusing on strengthening the dynamic, better understanding the dynamic in which this struggle of the child occurred. And so we are recommending that they're in their own therapy. We do provide a weekly Zoom with our director of family services, that the parents or whomever is involved in the case can join and is receiving education, is receiving support, and that's once a week, and that's not with the client present. So that's just their own separate process. Typically, also weekly, the primary therapist who's working with the individual is checking in with the family and then inviting them to be part of the process when that is part of the person's treatment plan. We spoke a moment ago about staging things, right? So sometimes if we also introduce too much of that family focus with the client, that could derail the relationship with the therapist, the trust building, the focus. So it's really for the therapist to use their skills to say, okay, this is when we need to introduce the actual family systems work and invite them in. Then that would either be done through Zoom or through the family being invited to come down, which many families have come down to Florida for that. And that's a very meaningful thing when it occurs within the context of the program. But I will also say, back to my original point, when we think this is going to be, the rehab stage is where everything happens. It's this quick, magical, thing that we push a button and we speed everything up like a microwave. That's where people fail. So a lot of that family work is a long-term process, and the person is not necessarily ready to connect back to a family system. That's exactly what we're doing with them. We're equipping them with the skills and the safety and the insight and the maturity to return back to a family unit and be able to then start repair work. So the deeper family work is not happening in the rehab. If anything, those are just conversations that are setting the stage to take that work with them, to make it portable, as part of the doggy bag on the way out is, okay, this is a full of information as to what's been going on with your loved one. This is the kind of family work we're going to recommend. You started the process. You started to have the seeds of those conversations, but nowhere near do we expect that it's going to be a meaningful, lasting work. But we offer those services, and it's important. People should not feel they're sending their loved one in and then not doing any of their own work.
Right. And because I think it acknowledges that when someone ends up in the rehab, the environment has failed too. That not every, it's not only that person and that has gone through a journey, but their journey is probably very much influenced by a failure in their larger environment, whatever that means.
Yeah. And maybe
And
if we can actually stick to that for a moment, I'd love
yeah,
to just maybe go a little bit deeper into that, because I do think there is this misnomer that many families have when they see their loved one has an addiction in particular, but it can manifest in any other way, where the problem is this one person and we have to get this one person help. And there is this lack of insight often in terms of how much the environment, has contributed. And I want to broaden that from the family environment to the community environment, right? Because you mentioned earlier, so much of what we do and so much of what I personally do is figure out how we're bringing in the religious aspect, the cultural aspect into it. And from what I find is that no matter who you are and what the nature of the struggle is and what the degree of observance a person still has or doesn't have, when a Jewish person comes from the community into rehab, they are coming with a whole story as to what their experiences have been like inside of systems, inside of a yeshiva system, a Beis Yaakov system, school system, a family system, a broader Jewish community system. We are people who have been, each one of us is attached to so many different structures. And so rehab is a structure. And so much of what we get to see by using the unique intervention of a rehab is everything the person has experienced with systems now becomes transferred onto the system of rehab. So I tell within often a few minutes if a person has resisted or been hurt in the yeshiva system based upon how they react when they are given the rules and regulations of the rehab. If they're fighting it, if they're feeling like they're not being cared about because of it, all that tells me there is institutional trauma here. And so many of our boys and girls who are coming from the Jewish community are coming with trauma that has taken place in a system. And that's another benefit of the rehab is we have the ability to have corrective emotional experiences inside of a new system. And that does often, it'll touch upon religious, spiritual, cultural identity and experiences. And so I think that's a really, really important thing is that this is not a two-dimensional experience where they have, bipolar disorder, depression, they're coming into treatment, they're getting treated for bipolar depression, and they're going to walk out. It's that so much of their whole story of how they feel about themselves in the community, in that whole system, is now being brought to the surface in this system called, the rehab. And I think that's incredibly important for families to understand. It's a lot more what we do becomes a 3D systems intervention than just a symptom intervention.
Do you think this is missed in most rehabs? This dimension of it, this idea that, a rehab that doesn't have the unique experience of understanding the yeshiva experience, the Beis Yaakov experience, the Sem experience, even the married from Jewish life experience within the community. And they are treating like either the mental health condition or the addiction, like with a kind of like focus specifically on those things that they're missing, that those things didn't happen in a vacuum. And if we don't look at the larger systematic failure, then probably the success to make this the beginning of treatment have a bigger chance of failing at it right out of the gate.
I think the simple answer is that a lot of it's missed in terms, especially in terms of the systems piece. I think that, rehabs that are looking at the relational piece, so they can pick up on the fact that someone might have an insecure attachment style now, and it might be, something that happened in their home, and very much we're looking at how a person, relates to external relationships. But in terms of understanding the cultural specific experiences that these, boys and girls are coming from the community, I do think that that's not something most rehabs are designed to understand or focused on. I missed it in the beginning, a few years, of my career, even being part of the community. It took me several years to really see how that is so much of what we're doing, and how when we're designing these programs now, every single element of how we do it, how we set up our Shabbos meal, um, and the way we interact with every single aspect of spirituality and culture in the rehab is going to be a unique clinical opportunity to bring to the surface so many of their past experiences within that. Meaning, for a Shabbos meal, for some of them, that is where so much of their feelings of not being seen or being pressured or not living up to something or not feeling aligned with themselves happen at the Shabbos table. So by offering a Shabbos table in a rehab, it's not just about giving them food on a Friday night. It's about now creating a whole platform in which to bring all of those feelings up, process it, and then create new ways of being. We've had people who were the quiet ones at Shabbos table, now over time being the leaders, being the ones who to shop and to cook and to play a whole new role at the Shabbos table. Actually, on a neurobiological level, is starting to rewire, those associations. When we have a rabbi, we have a program rabbi by design. Initially, I didn't want to bring a rabbi in because everyone told me no one's going to want to talk to the rabbi. They come into your rehab because they want to run away from it. And every single Jewish client, no matter what degree of observance, has flocked to that group. Sometimes it's to share the pain. And it's the rabbi who walks in. I always joke that when the rabbi walks in, now the rabbis of your whole experiences have walked in, and all of your feelings are going to come up. So I would say, curse out this rabbi, right? I picked a rabbi who's very much aware of mental health, and he jokes, he was going to show to wear this kind of hat or this kind of shirt, right? We're aware that what we're doing is we're bringing up platforms to experience everything in the past and rewrite the scripts, for yourself. And so that piece, I think, has taken me personally many, many years to fine tune. I'm still learning. I'm still seeing what it is that our clients need to have available. And even the way we invite someone to a Shabbos meal in the rehab or to have kosher food. Many of our clients will be kosher one day, not kosher the next, and then kosher again on Thursday. And the way that our team handles that becomes clinical. And every piece of this now becomes clinical because we have such a beautiful opportunity to give them a new experience of a system, a new experience of a community, and a new experience of a Jewish community, inside of these walls.
Wow. The feeling I'm getting is that that we're not just looking at transference on an interpersonal level, but we're looking at transference and experiential experiences on a systematic, on the Jewish experience, on the religious level, and each one is a point and a detail, a data point, and to making it sound very clinical, but each one is a point of connection that I can relationally use and see what is happening for this person.
Absolutely. I had a young man who came in after being thrown out of 3 different yeshivas, and he came into a rehab, which very much operates in a similar way. And I could see how he already assumed he was going to be kicked out. And so he did something within the first few days to see, if he's going to get kicked out. He assumed that would happen. And when we called him in to talk about it, and we said, "We're not kicking you out. Absolutely not. You can do whatever you want to do. You're not being kicked out." Watching his face. And it was from that moment on where the kind of new experiences he had, no longer being the bad one who breaks the rules, but really realizing this is a place that he's going to be seen, he's going to be connected with. It was a beautiful, beautiful experience. I've had women who the first few days they're trying to figure out if they should wear tights or not wear tights because it's going to hurt their shidduchim. And I remind them, no one here is looking at you in terms of shidduchim. We're looking at you. And they take their tights off. Not because they're rebelling against, Yiddishkeit. This woman remains theist the whole time, but her thinking was, 1 second, I'm not doing things anymore for the sake of the system. I'm going to do it for myself. I'm going to actually get to explore what that is. I'm not playing the same role that I played within my community. I don't have to be the Balas Chesed who, we've had women who were used to running whole Shabbos meals for other people and community organizations and all of that. And then they come to us and they get to just figure out who they are. They don't have to play that role anymore. And so a lot of that kind of identity testing, not having to fit a role that they were placed in, that's huge. That's huge.
You mentioned earlier that watching the interaction with peers, the community aspect of what happens in the rehab is in some ways almost more important, or it carries a lot of weight in terms of the opening for a person to see themselves differently, to experience themselves differently, to become relationally more aware and able to relate better. I'm very curious, and this is based on feedback that I've gotten from some of my clients that have struggled with severe addiction, that they said that precisely those peer relationships, like they started this sometimes like very young, barely like maybe 18, 19-year-old people that started relationships in rehabs with people that are lifers, as they're called. People have been in and out for life in rehabs 30, 40 years old, not able to stay sober in any way. So precisely those peer relationships have turned a negative aspect in the post rehab life. So how do you as a director, question one, how do you as a director monitor for that? And number two, more importantly, how does one, I'm a parent sending my child away, kind of hoping that they get this new beginning. How do I avoid that?
Such an important question. The reality is that there's very much not only a risk of that, but that often does happen. Meaning there often is, um, now that I can come in and I can develop relationships with the opposite gender or with people outside of the community. So we do see that. And it would be, it would be a lie for me to tell a parent that's not a risk. What I have seen and what I believe, and I'm looking at it from, the lens of a trauma therapist, is that what we're getting to see is what is already occurring within them. Whatever susceptibility they have to an unhealthy dynamic and an unhealthy relationship, whatever experimentation they're wanting to do, um, with connecting to somebody, from a different culture. Whatever's going on with them in terms of, the other gender and wanting to have, engage in all sorts of relationships. So as a director in a facility where we're monitoring for safety, what we do is very clear. We have cameras, we have staff that is making sure that nothing, inappropriate's unfolding. Um, and if and when it does, and we want some of that to happen, we are processing what happened for you when you as a woman were engaging in a romantic dynamic with a man in rehab, and you're a frum woman, you're a basic, you're in basic system, and now you're talking to this this male. We're not looking at it that what happened was that this male was in front of her. We're looking at it that these are dynamics, these are ways, the fact that she's seeking this kind of external validation, the fact that she's engaging in this way. So now we get to process it. And going back to what I'm saying before, if we're looking at this like a clinical laboratory, and we're almost introducing all sorts of things because of the transference piece, we want them to naturally have these kinds of dynamics so that we can understand in real time what's happening. For the girl that's being flirtatious, there's so much to use. For the boy who is now wanting to kind of make friends with guys from all sorts of different cultures and backgrounds, and now the mother is worried he's not going to be from anymore. That's what was happening already internally. Now we're getting to see it happening externally so that we can actually address it. What I have seen is those have been some of the most important clinical situations to be able to use, and it's all about whether the therapist is aware of it, and helping the person through it. But these are things that a person is going to likely engage in anyway, and we're going to not be able to intervene. So I'm not afraid of these things. I think they're important. I can tell you story after story of how that kind of relationship, even happening on the outside, got a person back, into therapy. And now they said, okay, wow, that relationship was horrible for me. Now I'm ready.
Right. So in other words, if someone were to create like a gender segregated, let's say, just for the argument, let's say if we're talking about those kind of relationships, you're missing a really, really big clinical piece. Like you're not able to see that dimension of where a person shows how they're exploring and seeing the world is from that lens.
I have that question all the time. I was just asked, we had a young man who came into us, and he said, I struggle with love and sex addiction. I can't come into a program with other women. And I said, well, if you struggle with love and sex addiction, it'd be fantastic to come into a program with other women, because then you go into a group, you have a certain inclination, a certain feeling, and you go right into your therapist's office and you process that. Sure enough, he came to us within the first day. That's exactly what happened. For the first time in his life, he's actually processing it. And it's not just from the corner of speculation, but it's actually things that are happening. And so it's so much more meaningful and so much more real. Sure, if you're in a place that doesn't monitor well, and so a person could actually engage in a lot of rehab romance behaviors, I would say to keep them away. If it's going to be a distraction and there's a certain compulsivity to it, maybe that's when it's time for a single gendered program. So I'm not saying across the board, co-ed programs, but I think for going back to our community, a lot of times people will think, and you and I maybe have touched on this together outside of this, people will think that they're sex addicted, they're love addicted, and really it's that they've never had opportunities to have healthy relationships, healthy conversations with members of the opposite gender. And so that is something that they can kind of play around with in a safe clinical environment like this one. And many people for the first time have said, now I'm ready to date, because I just spent time for the first time with other women, and I've learned that I can have, non-objectified conversations.
Wow, I really like this piece. Let's maybe dig a little deeper. So, first of all, let's talk about prevalence. How um, do you see a larger instance of, maybe call it sex addiction, compulsive sexual behaviors, compulsive love behaviors, or lack of healthy sexuality within the frum community coming, at least requesting to come to your program, or what does that look like?
Yes. Yes, and yes. I have seen people come in because they believe that the actual issue is that there's a sex addiction component, when they absolutely do not meet criteria whatsoever for an addiction. These are healthy inclinations that don't have healthy outlets. And so they turn to unhealthy outlets because they've never been guided as to how to develop healthy relationships. And I think that is another cultural piece. I get calls all the time from men who have only been in single gendered yeshivas, They've never been in an environment where they could speak to a woman, meet a woman, develop a relationship. They feel that there is same-sex attraction often, and they're coming in to explore that. Um, they're watching pornography, and they feel that they're now an addict. When you get deeper into it, by no means are they an addict. And I think that because there is now more in our community, and awareness and a willingness to speak about topics of sexual addiction, um, people now who are experiencing struggles in that department are latching on, and they're becoming part of 12-step fellowships. They're naming it, but really the issue so much is coming from many other things, self-esteem, comfort, identity, attachment, trauma histories, all of the emotional regulation, all of these things. And that becomes really the core. And once we address those things, there's not a sexual addiction piece. We then do see people who that is truly part of their struggle, and I'm by no means minimizing that exists, but I think the prevalence um, is a very different number than in the non-Jewish community, where there's not shame and guilt and confusion surrounding this topic to begin with.
Wow. Let's step out for the rehab setting then for a second. Um, a young man been in a single gendered yeshiva system, even young woman being in a single gendered Beis Yaakov or seminary system, sheltered, not having a healthy relationship to her or his sexuality due to parents' their inability, maybe their uncomfortability around their own sexuality, and definitely not having any meaningful conversation age appropriate along the way. So they're having a tortured relationship. But let's say a guy, he's watching porn, he's masturbating, and seems to not be able to stop. Do you think that there's in some people will say you need to be able to stay 90 days sober before you can even think about getting into a relationship with a woman? And please correct me if I'm wrong, but there's the piece that I heard that you're saying he's precisely having this relationship with pornography and masturbation, possibly because has never had the opportunity to truly relate in a healthy way to a woman. Do you have anything to add to this piece?
Asking such a loaded, controversial question. This is where I'm going to go back to my point about staging, right? I think so much in general as a human, we're developing in stages. We start off as an infant, we go over toddler years, young adult. So much of what I'm seeing from our young adults, and I'm not here to implicate the systems and why this is happening, but what I'm seeing inside the rehab is a lot of our young adults are coming in stunted emotionally and sexually. There is almost like they froze at a certain age. I often see a lot of the clients in our mid-20s are coming in more like young adolescents, 14, 15-year-olds. And I think there is something about the struggle to kind of develop in that way. And so just like you might see, 12 and 13-year-old feeling certain feelings and wanting to be able to one day use that to continue developing a relationship, it's the same way with these 20-year-olds. They have these feelings and they don't yet know how to link that to creating meaningful relationships with themselves or with others. And so I think we have to stage it where if they're just like if a 12-year-old who can't yet make that relationship is starting to engage in inappropriate outlets, we do have to have a behavioral approach to kind of limiting those behaviors. We can't just say, okay, go off and have a relationship and that will take care of it. We have to first curb some of the behaviors. It's the same thing here, where if it's gotten out of hand, if there are compulsions, if there are kind of neural networks where they have a certain feeling and they're going to pornography and masturbation and starting to get into unhealthy things, the answer would not be go develop a relationship, because they're not necessarily capable. It's that if we're simultaneously addressing the real core of it while giving them some guardrails for those behaviors, that typically, unless someone is a true sex addict, that typically is enough to then not need them to kind of identify as an addict and go into a 12-step program the same way an addict would, meaning it's giving us the awareness that, red alert, we have to equip them now with real relational skills So keeping them away then from a relationship would be counterproductive. But it matters about the timing.
So in some ways, like using maybe behavioral interventions that maybe curb the maladaptive behaviors such as watching pornography or masturbating uncontrollably, but also maybe at very shortly after introducing almost like a mixed gender processing group where there can be inching towards having a relationship with another person that is boundaried, but it's a relationship.
Absolutely. I'll never forget the first time I worked with a married man in another program that I was working in, and he had been recommended into a higher level of care before he got to us for sex addiction. He did that program for months and months on end, and he was in a 12-step program and starting to identify with that and being told to abstain from all sorts of relationship. And when I started working with him, it became very evident early on this is not a case of sex addiction. In fact, the behaviors he was engaging in does not meet the criteria for anything even compulsive. It was his relationship to the fact that he was watching pornography as a married man, and the shame and the guilt and the Rebbe who you know um, had good intentions but said, well, then you must be an addict and need to go into treatment. And he didn't think twice. When we did the work and we focused on kind of the IFS kind of work to get to know himself and to feel comfortable within himself and to go off and create a healthy relationship with a woman from there, those compulsions went away. So I think that a lot of it also has to do with our cultural beliefs, surrounding sexuality. And I think yes, if we have to look at the maladaptive behaviors, for a lot of people, it's not maladaptive as much as it's religiously problematic. And so there's a lot here that we have to process. But I think yes, that one size fits all of just telling a person to abstain from relationship with the opposite gender is often very much counterproductive. And so this is what going back to how we have to take that bigger picture lens and look at the full story and not just look at a symptom, and know how we can use a rehab environment to kind of introduce all sorts of new experiences in a safe and healthy way and play around with it a little bit. I mean, I joke with my colleagues that sometimes when a client is triggered by something, it could be something as simple as their lunch didn't arrive on time and now they're triggered. I said we should really consider hiring actors to start to trigger them purposefully, and we should do all sorts of things that trigger them purposefully. Um, because this is really where the meat and potatoes of the clinical work happens.
Mm. Um, I I want to, at the risk of not veering just a little bit more in the direction of sexuality and then coming back to rehab. Um, so as a clinician, what, how to look out for if you had like a short, maybe just a short piece of advice? How do I look out whether this is an addiction, a compulsion, or this is a relational piece? Because the treatment is quite literally on the opposites of the spectrum. If one is struggling with a compulsive behavior, they probably need to go to a group and identify in order to be able to gain some traction. Versus for the person that is using this in order to, which just adds a maladaptive behavior due to their relational um, issues towards sexuality, they might need to lean into it a bit more. So I'm a clinician, someone comes into the room, the behavior looks very similar. How, just briefly, what am I looking for?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with being willing as a clinician to hold both things at the same time, right? To hold that we might have to intervene and give them some practical skills-based work, and very behavioral focused work on mitigating behaviors that are causing distress, right? That are causing dysfunction, that are making a person unable to function because of the behavior. So a person who's, pornography and to the point of neglecting other things, starting to veer off behaviorally, getting into risky situations, compromising, themselves in ways, compromising relationships, then yes, we need to be addressing the behavior. But often if we listen to the story of pain, the story of emptiness, the story of intimacy that is sought but not filled. We have to be at the same time looking at what are those obstacles? Why is a person not able to engage in a meaningful, fulfilling relationship with intimacy, with sexual fulfillment? Um, and we have to be paying attention to that at the same time, especially if the person is currently married or at the age where they can be dating for marriage, and if there's blocks and they're choosing artificial sexual relationships, what is happening? And usually there's usually there's a relational limitation there. So I think both things have to be true. I think we can't excuse and enable behaviors because we understand where it's coming from, and we can't just say the antidote is to go off and develop a relationship if you're not yet there. Similar to how I said, if we're in a stabilization phase, we can't do trauma work. If we have to stabilize behaviors, we can't expect them to be able to now have healthy relationships. But it's about not pushing a person to identify their behaviors as addictive, which I have seen to backfire, um, as opposed to understand that this is a healthy need that you are now overly focusing on because you're seeking intimacy. And so I think that on a very, very basic level, if a person's behaviors have escalated, and they need to come into a rehab program, usually they're coming in with a lot of co-occurring, struggles. Very rarely is someone coming in just, for that. I think that applies to people in the regular population as well, but especially in the Jewish population. So I think it's really holding both things at once. Obviously, I'm personally not a CSAT. I mean, thank God we have many in our community. I know you're doing a lot of this work, where there's skills-based focus on how we address and intervene on the behaviors. But I think from what I've seen, we either have behavioral interventionists or we have trauma-based work for this. I think it's really a matter of combining both, in a little bit more of a sophisticated way, when we also introduce the concept of religious shame and guilt and how that makes some things look worse, because we're introducing the shame. So we have to get full stories, full pictures, and like you said, have a lot of those tools in our toolbox, but then be able to throw them away and say, okay, we have to address this as a whole picture with stages. Maybe now we focus on the behaviors, but then we have to quickly introduce the relational, attachment piece of this.
Yeah. So bring this back into the rehab setting. How often is it that someone comes in seemingly with a substance addiction, but there is also fairly shortly after arrival, you'll notice that there's also a behavioral piece, that there is also an unhealthy relationship with their sexuality or other forms of behavioral. Um,
All of it, right? If we move away from looking at the symptoms of this to the fact that there has been some kind of stunting in this person's development and their growth and their functioning, right? So then we're going to expect they're going to be playing around with all sorts of ways to self-medicate. So if they come in and there was marijuana and there was substances and there was, alcohol or in drugs, and then we take that away. If they don't yet have their replacement to living, what we call a well-rounded, fulfilled, functional life where we are doing productive things and we're getting the dopamine from that. We're creating relationships and we're getting the oxytocin from that. We're spiritually filled. We're doing these things. I mean, we all are drug addicts, right? It's just that we're getting drugs from healthy, adaptive things. So if a person doesn't yet have that, and they don't have emotional regulation skills. They don't have identity that's firmly rooted. It comes so much from external. They have shame and guilt, and maybe they have a lot of again, back to that institutional um, trauma. So they don't yet know how to connect to the world around them. So they're hiding or they're creating personas of being defiant and rebellious. So of course they're going to come in and they're going to play around with that. And relationships is the easiest thing. And that's why what I said before is when a professional team watches them relate to other people and then watches that progress from superficial validation external to trying to get people to like them or hiding away from them, trying to create personas, being mistrusting, getting triggered in conversations. When that starts to shift, that's when we know that the deeper work is taking root. So I would say everyone is walking with that because they don't yet have replacements. And what we're doing in a rehab is we're really clearing out the cobwebs. We're figuring out specifically for each person what skills need to be better strengthened, which muscles relationally need to be worked, what kind of trauma work maybe do they need to do to reprocess actual, developmental complex trauma that really is holding them back from from a neurobiological standpoint. We get to do a little bit of everything in rehab. And so we just start to open them up to the next phase. And then I want to just take a moment to say that's why the aftercare piece. Good rehab will be making an aftercare plan that is sustainable, where we are smoothly getting them to the outpatient therapist, psychiatrist, case management, which is huge. Or having a person afterwards, whether they're also going into a sober living for continued monitoring as they wean, slowly back into life. So all of that is, we have to expect that they're going to be referencing their addictions. They're going to be developing new unhealthy behaviors once we kind of get one under control. And that's all going to be there, just like for any one of us who is not dysfunctional enough to need a program. We're all doing that time where our maladaptive behaviors and habits are there. But it's if we're strengthening ourselves at the same time, those things organically are going to subside. So it's a matter of creating guardrails once we get to know what the person needs, external accountability and external encouragement, while we are giving them opportunities to develop themselves from the inside out through therapy, through productive behaviors, through reconnecting them to spirituality and addressing any religious trauma that might be there. And then it becomes an organic process, just like our children are developing. We can't have them move from age 1 to age 12. We can't have somebody in rehab move too quickly either, but it's about allowing them now to unfreeze the developmental freeze that happened at some point for a variety of reasons based upon the person's story.
Mhm. So I want to address the aftercare from a bit of an interesting lens. Let's talk cost. When you mention rehab to someone, they're like, no, 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 I can't afford that. $50,000 a month, 20, 30, like in very insane numbers. So first of all, what to say about that? But also what I've heard from quite a few people is that they've had insurance and they covered 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the insurance decided to cover. And the rehab is all over it. Family work, supportive, and the availability. The moment the day the insurance ceases, there's nobody to talk to anymore. No one, like the family feels like they were drugged. Here's your person back. There's no aftercare. There's no one to talk to. The person who created all these relationships with the therapist or their staff within the rehab, no access to them anymore. What to say to that?
Yeah, this topic breaks my heart. This is my my least favorite topic, and it's true. There is a cost to rehab. Rehab, just like anything else, if somebody needs medical care and needs to go to a hospital, what we there is a fee, and what's offered in a residential setting and how these residential settings are built, it's a very high fee. No doubt about that. And I think that families, especially in our community, we are used to in moments of crisis, we're going to figure it out, where we're going to raise the money, we're going to make it happen. And I think this is where so many families have gotten burned. We're in a moment of chaos because they think that rehab is that magic fix. They think it's going to be a one-time cost. So I'm going to raise the 30, 40, 50,000 and it's going to be worth it. And I'll send them in and everything will be fine. And I think this is what I spend a lot of time and get on my soapbox explaining to a family based on everything we just described, over this past, time together. Rehab is the very beginning. If you cannot afford it, if you do not have the insurance that will cover it, and if you can't get onto the insurance that will cover it, do not send to rehab. I think people have been burned, their finances have been burned because they think that it's going to be an isolated experience. Yes, rehabs, and especially ones, who are kind of financially driven. A lot of people own rehabs because they think it's going to be money making. It's a very, very messy, scary, shady industry. I've seen that firsthand. So it is the case that if you can't pay and you send your loved one in and you just assume it's going to work out magically, you're going to likely experience an unfinished treatment episode. I tell families if we can, to slow down, to make sure the finances are there, not just for the rehab, but for the aftercare. If you can, that then rehab has a function. And if you can't, we have to do this another way. Because a lot of families are getting burned because they are assuming that it will work out, that if I send my loved one in and the insurance doesn't pay, the rehab will keep them. Rehab is a business. It is service. And I think that we can't relate to it as much as like with that same kind of chesed focus as we can when we need other forms of services. These are for-profit programs. Some are better than others. I'm very blessed to work in a program where the owners are not financially profit driven. They did this because they want to create a good program. Nevertheless, we can't pay for people to come in. And I think families often are very disappointed when they hear the numbers and they assume, that they're going to be able to have financial discounts. And sometimes they can. And there's a lot of people in our community who are advocates, who will fight, who know which programs they can kind of get discounts from. But there is a heavy cost. And I think that it's a lot to do with our expectations versus just the fact that the industry, has some problems to it.
And what about the aftercare piece? So you talk about how important as we look at this as an opening to a new way of helping this person who entered rehab to begin their mental health journey, and this is the opening. When a rehab basically ceases care, the moment that there are financial and I understand the heavy costs of rehabs, because the truth is, if you literally have eyes on people 24/7 and you have all these wraparound services, stuff costs, life costs. Unfortunately, it is. But it doesn't it feels like very unfinished business when then the person is like, okay, your insurance doesn't pay anymore or your stint is up, and there's no continuation of care. There's almost like you have no more access to anyone. Is that rehab specific? Is this an industry problem? And do you do it differently? Like, what happens?
Yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with families not being properly educated and what to expect before they go in. From families that I personally work with, once we can know what their insurance, the coverage is going to be, and we can map out, how much time they're going to need in the rehab, what they can do outpatient, um, this is not happening. So people know their benefits typically before they go into a program, and a good program can kind of give you an estimate of that. If you are sending your loved one in just kind of hoping for the best and just with kind of your eyes closed, I think that's why families do end up, in these situations. I'm not blaming the families. I think that when a loved one is in crisis because they need to get them to a place, we don't have the capacity to think about the whole uh, assembly line of what's going to be needed from residential, to outpatient. But I think a lot of this could be mitigated with better education. That yes, a rehab, will oftentimes the length of stay depends on insurance benefits unless you can pay extra, and we need to anticipate that, and then we need to use the rehab in the proper way. We need to understand, like I've been saying, it's the beginning, and then we need to be able to save our resources, financial resources for the aftercare. If we burn all of the money on sending them to a program that has been, there's a fad and we think that this is the program, it's $50,000, I can't afford it, but I'm going to raise 50,000 and then send them in. This is what families need to understand. That's the first step in a multi-step program. Do not send someone in using all of your money for rehab. That is, if I can give like my one sentence to all families, it's save the money for the aftercare. Make sure you have enough for the aftercare. Understand what your insurance is going to cover, and then likely what's going to be needed afterwards. I'm having families call the sober livings before they even come to us to get the numbers to start to save that, that money, or fundraising to fundraise for that money, um, you know, the first day.
Meaning they think about the day after before they even start.
Correct.
Talking
You got
about
to slow
fads
it down.
for a moment, um, let's talk psychedelics, rehabs that do psychedelics. I think there are some in Florida. Like, any thoughts, any experience, any warnings, any?
I'm not an expert. I'm not a Bucky. I stay in my lane. But I think that for someone who has predispositions, and we don't yet know, their underlying, diagnoses. I've seen psychedelics, really trigger, kind of horrific, things. We actually have some people who come into us after psychedelic trips because it triggered psychosis, it triggered mania. Whether that's because it wasn't being done by a professional, whether it's a substance itself, I want to kind of stay away from weighing in on that. But just like anything else in the mental health, all I will say is nothing is one size fits all. Not one modality, not one substance, not one medication, not one rehab, nothing. And so, could psychedelics be a great intervention for a specific person? I'm sure it can be. I'm going to leave that to the people who have been spending their time on that. I personally, have not seen it be the magic elixir, and I think a lot of that might be because it's viewed as a magic elixir.
Same
But
little like the rehab, like the car wash, coming in, coming out
e-
clean type.
exactly. So, could it be part of a comprehensive, intentional, responsible treatment plan? I'm sure it can be. I think Hashem creates different interventions, different things for the right time. I have seen it being done irresponsibly, the same way I have seen people being sent to rehab irresponsibly.
Mm. So, um, first of all, I just want to, like, what I really overwhelmingly hear from you is, please, 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 if you rehab is an opening to a journey of better mental health afterwards, and if you are stuck on this idea that this is the cure all, the end all, don't even begin. It's you're going to see and experience failure. Um, Maybe can we speak if just a little briefly? So, how does one go about choosing a good rehab besides calling you and and checking in with you? So, like what's the process? My child needs rehab. They're open to it. I have the opportunity. How do I go about differentiating between what you've mentioned, that there are rehabs that are nefarious, that they're not in it for the right purpose. They're business. They're trying to create business, sometimes drum up business um, in very, very, very questionable ways, and we'll just leave it at that for a moment. So,
Absolutely.
how does one go about it?
Yeah. So I spoke a little bit about some of the potential limitations of the Jewish community, unfortunately, in terms of some of the lived experiences of some of the young men and women that I have seen. I want to talk about some of the beautiful things about our Jewish community, which is that we have set up infrastructure for support. We have organizations that are dedicated to providing free consultation and case management, whether it's Amudim, Relief, Mask, Nivonim, different organizations. Everyone, can do research on which organization they feel comfortable with.
But
But there
let's
are
maybe
people
take
who
a moment just to actually mention them. Relief, Amudim. You said mask and the fourth.
Mask, Nivonim. There are different
Avonim? I have
uh,
not. What's it called? The last one?
Nivonim.
Nivonim. Okay.
Yes. And so again, I don't personally give any stamp of approval or disapproval on any particular like third party organization, but I have worked with them all and I have been very, very grateful that people are spending their lives vetting programs, meeting with programs, knowing which programs work with which insurances, and providing this service. I'm a big believer that the more clinical evaluation we can do before rehab and slow the process down will set it up for success. So I often will say also to be working even with a therapist and a psychiatrist and understanding what is needed first so that we don't just send someone into the kind of the wrong kind of program. So really working with one person, one organization, one professional to guide the process. When I'm called by a therapist who knows what is needed from the care, and we have kind of already done the legwork, educating the families what to expect, that goes much better than cold calls. No one's ever even spoken to anyone before. They don't even know what it is. They just found something online. We need to be working with quarterback before, during, and after. And we are at Beachway are very much in favor of collaboration with outside professionals because we know that once they leave, they're going to be working with this team. We want the team involved, full transparency. We're going to be doing update calls to those people. So one thing that I find on the flip side is as a group of people, we like to shop around for a different psak, halacha. And sometimes we don't just stick to our one person. And I think that adds a lot of fear. So sometimes I'll get calls and the person just spoke to 10 other people and asked their opinions and advice, and it just creates chaos. So there are a lot of people in the community, once you need this, you unfortunately learn, this entire kind of web, this underground web of people who are involved in this space. Everyone has their different opinions, their different experiences. So I say find someone that you can work with as a family who is equipped to know what's needed for your specific situation and who knows different programs and could be an advocate, and stay with that person, that organization. Don't try to do this alone, but at the same time, don't shop around out of anxiety and try to get 100 opinions because like everything else, sometimes
You'll get
confuses
more
more than
confused.
anything else.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you a little bit shift to the closing questions, and this is more personal, a little bit outside of the space. Like, what is something that, okay, you have this platform, you can share something you've learned in maybe in your own life, not so much even related to rehab and recovery and therapy, but something that if you could share on a space where people will listen to it, like that you feel like would be very helpful for people to know.
Okay, what a important question and a big question. I can just speak from the heart, for a moment. I think that anytime, we want kind of these quick fixes, quick solutions, quick answers, it's hurtful with mental health. And I think for me personally, something I find very meaningful about my work is the spiritual component. And I think it goes for the same way. I think a lot of questions I personally get have to do with Yiddishkeit, right? My loved one is no longer religious. How can we send him into your program and get him more religious? Or my loved one is, and I'm afraid of what's going to happen. And I personally went into this field because I was interested in how spiritual development kind of connects to emotional development and psychological development. And I was excited to use spirituality as a resource to help people and to bring that in. I actually was, before anything else, I was trained in spiritually integrated treatment. And I have in my time doing this learned how complex our religious and spiritual can be when it comes to struggles with mental health. And I think that families who are too focused on the outcome of anything, the outcome of religiosity, the outcome of emotional well-being, and are not giving enough space to the individual development and appreciating the person. And so much of what comes out in this process is a person learning about and owning their strengths in general, how they connect to themselves and how they connect to Hashem. And I think that when families are so afraid and they want everything to be perfect and they want, their loved one is a masmid who's davening 3 times a day and from and healthy and there's no mental health problems and everything is outcome, people are feeling so misunderstood and not seen and so in pain and not developing themselves, and not experiencing healthy relationships because they're feeling that there's something wrong with them. And I think if we really allowed our children, I'll speak more to parents, if we really allowed our children and we've celebrated who they are and we realize that, people are created differently and have, and Hashem wants different people to have different kohos and different talents. And we started to see a person for who they are and we allowed them to go on these journeys and we celebrated that. And we're not so afraid of outcomes. I think we would see people who are empowered to develop themselves, find themselves. And I think we would see people more connected spiritually, more connected emotionally. And I think a lot of it has to do with the messaging that we give our children about who they are and how they're allowed to be different than us and different than we thought, different than our school systems maybe, and celebrated, those kinds of things. And I think on a personal level, it's something I have been a different parent. I'm trying to be a different parent, after my experiences. I'm hoping for different changes in the community. And I'm seeing that there's hope. There's hope. I've seen beautiful, beautiful people go through this process and come out the other side strong, impressive, admirable, individuals. And I think it's a matter of just how we approach that process.
Wow. In short, if I'm a parent, parent for ourselves, expectations to ourselves is like, don't focus on the outcome. It's all about the journey, and appreciate the journey and trust the journey. I think trust just whatever will happen is going to be a growing and meaningful journey. And it's precisely if you de-emphasize maybe the end result is when that journey then you can trust the journey. But if
Yeah,
you're
and
so constantly focused on that outcome, that can create a lot of um, uh, discontent.
a lot pressure and pain. And so much of the stories of the addiction is I could never find myself. I can never be myself. I was in a system, a yeshiva system that didn't see me. I didn't see myself. And I think if we start to see again, and back to your original question of what is rehab, it's the start of that journey. It's the beginning of that journey. Use it well. If we have the right expectations, if we send them to the program with competent, caring professionals, if we educate ourselves about the nature of our loved one's struggle, and we expect it's going to be a longer haul, if we have the financial resources, in place, then it's the beginning of an often very meaningful journey.
Devora, I want to thank you. Um, Again, just for I feel like I've come out of the last hour and a half, just learned, have a different understanding of what rehab really is, how to approach it, and I feel more empowered to be quite honest, just on a very personal level. So I really want to thank you for taking the time. I know this took a little while to put it all together, but I do deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you, and thank you for the opportunity and asking questions that so many people are asking. And I really, really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, and have a beautiful rest of your day.
Well, thank you. Take care.
Take care.